Hello, it's Zoe Kimpel. These are my results so far on the final project for 413. I started just by looking at the two cities' combined total cases, and you can see how the data has various peaks throughout the time series over the years. Looking at the two cities separately, you can see how the peaks differ somewhat between the two areas, which can hopefully be explained by some of the predictor variables. But because of this, I decided to break up most of my models into a model for each city in order to better accommodate predicting the total cases. Looking at a histogram of the two cities, you can see how most of the cases are small integer numbers with some very large outliers on the larger side of the total cases. So I took this into consideration and decided to remove some of these outliers, which will be explained in further slides. Looking at some of the predictor variables and their relationship between the total cases, there were some that stood out as being visually especially related. So the minimum air temperature is 1. If the air temperature remained at a very high temperature, then there were more cases seen, which makes sense since the fever is transported through mosquitoes. And if the temperature doesn't come down low enough, then the mosquitoes don't die off, so you could see more cases of the fever. Dew point was also significant to the relationship of total cases. The higher the dew point, the more total cases, generally speaking. And then the precipitation amount also seems somewhat related. So the precipitation amount, for the most part, stayed kind of on the lower end. But you can see how when the precipitation is lower, the total cases are higher, generally speaking. I also looked at the seasonality of the time series data sets. So as you can see, there is some seasonality later in the year. There are higher cases, but it definitely depends on the specific year. It's not a for every year these weeks see a higher cases, but there is some seasonality that might be relevant to a model. I also looked at the decomposition of the two cities' time series. So you can see how the time series is broken up into the season and trend. And because the patterns here are pretty evident, that was one reason I chose to build an ETS model to capitalize on the cyclicity of the seasonality there and be able to capture the total cases with that model. To prepare the data for the models, again, two different data sets were created for some of the models, splitting the two cities apart and building a unique model for each city. The total cases, the outliers were dealt with either by removing anything above the 90th percentile for each of the cities for the regression models. And for some of the time series models, I limited the time range that was used to train the model to prevent any skewness of the data from those large peak outliers in the total cases. The NAs in the data set were replaced by the column mean. And then I also was careful not to incorporate any multicollinearity in the models, since some of the predictor variables, especially the ones that were duplicated across reanalysis and station, seem to be very similar and correlated with each other. Both time series and regression models were built to predict the total cases in the future. Since an integer was required, the time series models were rounded, and then some of the forecasts predicted a negative total case, which is not possible, so those were cut at 0 before submission. The time series models I worked with so far, the ETS and the neural net model. Hopefully I'm going to try an ARIMA model as well. And then for the regression models, also using rounding in order to create these as an integer for the linear model and cutting that at 0 so that no negative total cases are predicted. And then a Poisson model was also used, which already outputs a count integer variable. So those were just cut at 0 to prevent any negative total cases being predicted. So here are the results for 6 of the different modeling scenarios. Again, the difference between many of the models is just if both cities were included in one model and if the outliers were removed. So the best performing model, according to data-driven, was the ETS model, where a unique model was built for each of the cities and then combined for the final forecast. This model also performed well against the test data set when I was building the model, so that wasn't too surprising that that was the best performing one. The neural net was the least successful one according to data-driven, and the linear regression models performed pretty well, better than the Poisson regression model, which was a little surprising. The Poisson regression performed pretty well in the test data set. It did seem to be that removing the outliers did have a positive impact. So as you can see, linear regression 3, the outliers were removed, and that ended up being the second best model on data-driven. To improve in the future, I think it would be interesting to add additional variables such as medical information, if there's any vaccination history, as well as the population. I could see that impacting the total cases. In addition, it would be interesting to increase the model complexity, trying out like a recurrent neural network to see if that would improve the mean average error for the total cases. I also want to reiterate, just as a lesson learned, same from the midterm, it's always surprising how well the time series models perform, even when no external predictors are included. So never underestimate them. Thank you guys for listening.